Today we're going to take a look at the Rams draft this season and the implications for the future. We'll be looking at it through the lens of me being a coach, the experience I have there, the schemes that I've studied, and the history that the Rams have in the draft. You're not used to seeing my face. I'm Dean. I'm the guy that breaks down the film here. I'm a high school coach in Tennessee. Been a Rams fan forever, and excited to talk about the draft today. So, first, we have to talk about our team building plan and evaluate what we already have on the roster. So, our team building plan for the remodel, not rebuild, they don't want to use that word, but for the 2023 season, is we want to find the holes. And if you look closely enough, this is something that they have done in the past, back whenever we had our first Super Bowl window in the Todd Gurley and Jared Goff era. So we made the Super Bowl and we lost, but we kind of attributed it to, Cooper Kupp was hurt, Todd Gurley was hurt, and we still made the Super Bowl. So we were thinking that, when everybody came back healthy, we'd be ready to roll. And then the 2019 season did not go as planned. So what they did was they used the 2020 season to find the holes, used the 2020 season to establish the new defensive scheme, and then in the 2021 off season, or the season prior to the 21 season, they went out and patched those holes. We got Matt Stafford as an example there. We knew that we needed a new quarterback. We knew that we needed a way to find those explosive plays that we were trying to limit on defense. So we had to go and attack that weakness. That's what we're going to be doing this season. It's not a secret. Kevin Demoff put that memo out there a couple weeks ago. But we're going to use this season to find the holes in our roster and use the resources that we are gaining in next offseason to attack them. So our strategy for this draft should be the way that I'm thinking about it is we're going to raise the floor of the roster through getting better depth. The majority of our depth the last few seasons, because we've been such a top-heavy roster, is UDFAs, the undrafted rookie free agents. So we need to use this draft. So instead of having undrafted free agents as our second and third string players, we could have fourth, fifth, and sixth round picks. So sometimes there's not a huge difference between, fourth, fifth, and sixth rounders versus undrafted free agents, but sometimes there is. And we've seen, especially this past year, that our UDFA depth is not, where our depth needed to be, even though we had to use a lot more depth than every other team in the league when they broke it down based on cap dollars. So we've got the season to find our holes, using this draft to raise the floor of our roster. Then, as I mentioned, we're going to use our newfound cap space and draft capital next offseason to raise the ceiling of our roster by getting our new superstar players that will be our next pillars that can bridge that gap between Stafford, Kupp, and Donald to the next era and maybe even be those new pillar players themselves. So, and again, we're going to raise the ceiling of the roster instead of, if building the floor is better depth, we're going to increase our ceiling by getting better starters where we need better starters based on where the holes are that we found in this 2023 season. So let's take a look at how the Rams evaluate and devaluate or devalue different positions on the team. First off, the number one priority for the team is QB1. Now, this is not just quarterbacks. This is the first string quarterback position. So in our history, we traded up to get Jared Goff. These valuations come from the entire Sean McVay era. Les Snead, I was only about 15, 16 at the time, but Les Snead seemed to be a very different general manager during the Jeff Fisher era than during the Sean McVay era. So we got our QB1. We traded up for Jared Goff, which was admittedly the last draft of the Jeff Fisher era, but we were aggressive in our pursuit of a new quarterback. Then we ate his dead money after we signed him to a contract and traded 2 first-round picks for Stafford. So we know that we value this position based on these moves. Wide receiver is another position that we value. We have given multiple large contracts over the last decade. We gave huge contract to Cup, multiple nice size contracts to Cup. Robert Woods, we gave a good contract to Allen Robinson. It didn't pan out, but we know that they value that position because of the money they've spent there. We've also spent multiple day 2 draft picks on wide receivers, one of them being Cup, then Van Jefferson and Tutu Atwell. So there's a lot of total resources that we have allotted to the wide receiver position. We're talking cap dollars and premium draft picks that are made even more premium whenever they're your first picks of the draft. I can't remember if Jefferson or Akers went first in that draft, but they were both our second round picks there. And then Atwell was our first pick in that draft too. So we're talking about our first players off the board being wide receivers that aren't even coming in and starting right away because we've also paid a bunch of other wide receivers. So lots and lots of resources dedicated to the wide receiver position. Tight end, another position that we value. We've given, I believe, 2 big contracts to Higbee, and rightfully so. It's pretty statistically clear that he's the best tight end in franchise history. But we have given, relative to most other teams and their tight ends, we've given a lot of resources to Higbee. We've also spent multiple early to mid-round draft picks on tight ends in the last decade. There's Gerald Everett. He was a second or third round pick. Tyler Higbee, I believe, was a 4th round pick. Then we had Bryson Hopkins and Jacob Harris, who were also 4th and 5th round picks too. So mid-round draft picks, couple early round draft picks, plus money again to Higbee. This is another position that we value. The offensive line I'm saying we value it. I think some people don't think that, but I think we value it a little differently than others. We have given large contracts to players and positions that we needed to. We gave a good contract to Whitworth. Noteboom was given, I think it's like 3 years, $45 million. Havenstein's had 2 nice size contracts. And then to a lesser degree, we did extend Brian Allen. He's not making just a ton of money, but for a team that doesn't always pay every single offensive lineman, giving that kind of money to him was a bit shocking and shows that we do value the position in a certain way. We've spent many mid-round draft picks there. We've got Joe Noteboom and Logan Bruss that were 3rd-round picks. Allen was a 4th-round pick. So we have spent some significant resources in the offensive line room as well. Moving over to defense, we value our defensive line. That's pretty obvious, given that we've got maybe the best defensive lineman ever, and we've paid him twice, made him the highest paid non-quarterback in the league, if I'm not mistaken. So we've given large contracts not only to Aaron Donald, though, but there's Michael Brockers. He was paid, I want to say twice. I could be wrong there, but he was a highly compensated member of the team for quite a long time. Then we did pay Ashawn Robinson. We paid him decently off the free agent market, 3 years. I can't remember quite however many million, but it was in that $5 to $10 million range, which is a nice chunk of change whenever you're a top-heavy team like we are. We've also picked AD whenever we got Aaron Donald. Remember, we had a good defensive line in place already. I've got notes of this later on too, but we were a 4-down defense at that time. We had Robert Quinn and Michael Brockers, who were young pups in the league back then, and they were looking like studs already. Then we had steady veterans, Will Hayes and Kendall Langford. And back in the early 2010s, you would call that maybe our best position group outside of middle linebacker, which was just run by James Laurinaitis. So we've spent quite a few resources on defensive line too. We've spent tons of mid-round picks on defensive linemen. Greg Gaines, Bobby Brown, John Franklin Myers. Man, I wish we could have him right now. Ernest Brown the 4th. So plenty of picks in that, especially really like the 4th round. I think I want to say all of these guys are 4th rounders. Brown Ernest Brown might have been a fifth, but definitely lots of mid-round picks spent here. Edge rusher is obviously another one that we valued. We gave big contract to Leonard Floyd. We spent resources on the Dante Fowler trade, on the Von Miller trade. Not only did we trade a 2 and a 3 for Miller, we did offer him a large contract. Obviously not as large as the one he got in Buffalo, but it was a large contract, especially for us. We've got a bunch of mid-round selections too here with Sam Ebicom and Terrell Lewis. So these are even more premium positions we've traded. We traded our whole day 2 last year for 8 weeks of Von Miller, and it worked out pretty well. We didn't get him signed to that contract though. All right, so those are the positions that I believe we value. Let's talk about the ones that we devalue. Running back. I don't think that we are likely to just to pay a running back in the post Todd Gurley era, just because of how they were bit kind of in the tail by that. But we have spent some day 2 picks, overlapping rookie contracts. So this is kind of a mix between valuing and devaluing. To me, it's more of just we value it differently a little bit, because we will still spend premium draft capital on running backs. But I just don't think we're likely to pay for one. They did make a pretty aggressive trade offer for Christian McCaffrey at the deadline too. So again, this is an interesting position with how we value it, and we're going to talk more about the running back position here in a little bit. Safety is one that I think is pretty undeniable that we don't value. We have not paid a safety since LaMarcus Joyner, since he got the franchise tag. We haven't given a second contract, I believe, to any safety other than maybe a year here or there, but I don't really count that as a second contract. Again, kind of like running back, though, we have spent some day 2 picks. Taylor Rapp was a second rounder. John Johnson was a third rounder. So any day 2 picks when you don't have day 1 picks are some premium capital. So these two are very similar in that we don't quite pay the players that we draft, but we will draft these positions a little higher than other positions like the defensive line that we just talked about. We've also spent some day 3 picks on safeties. Jordan Fuller, Nick Scott, Quentin Lake, Russ Yeast were all day 3 picks, all 6th and 7th round picks there too, and we've gotten quite good value for them. But this is not a position that we're going to pay a player for. Corner. This one's going to be this is probably my first hot take of the show here, but I don't think that the Rams value cornerback, especially not as much as a lot of what I'm seeing here in the pre-draft process. Let's talk about it. We have made some trades for Jalen Ramsey, Marcus Peters, Aqib Talib. That would show that we value the corner position. One thing to remember is when we made those trades, we were running the Wade Phillips defense. We are now running Raheem Morris's version of Brandon Staley's version of the Vic Fangio defense, and they are very, very different. We've spent mid-round picks on corners. We've got David Long. We had David Long, but we got Robert Rochelle and Kobe Durant now. We've had late-round picks in UDFAs. Troy Hill was a UDFA. Darius Williams, Darian Kendrick, Dante Dion, all late round picks or UDFAs. We didn't, we weren't their first team for Dion. We got him, I think, from the Ravens, but he was a late round pick UDFA kind of guy. But why? So all these things say that we should value this position, right? This is the evidence right here. Why am I saying it's devalued? I gave you the hint a little bit ago. Our scheme is not reliant on a shutdown corner. I'm not going to go too far into it. If you want to go to a little bit more of a breakdown of why I'm saying we're not reliant on the shutdown corner, go back and watch the defensive film breakdowns that I've made. I talk a little bit about them there. But team success league-wide is not reliant on a shutdown corner either. If you look at the Final Four teams in the playoffs, The Eagles were the only ones that had even corners that were household names. I would, I'm a football guy. I'm a football coach. When I'm not coaching football or drawing up plays, at nighttime when my family goes to bed, I'm playing Madden most of the time. And even I couldn't tell you the corners on the Chiefs, the Bengals, or the 49ers that were healthy at that time. Now, the Eagles, obviously, they had Darius Slay and James Bradbury, and he's not a corner, but Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Avonte Maddox is in the mix somewhere over there, kind of playing nickel, the last I saw. But only in the Final Four, one team had corners. I wouldn't even consider them shutdown corners. They're like B plus, A minus corners in my opinion, but they're not, they're not going to completely X out the receiver that they're covering. And if you look at the top corners in the league, they didn't make the playoffs. Sauce Gardner with the Jets, not in the playoffs. Jalen Ramsey, not in the playoffs. Marcus Lattimore, not in the playoffs. Trey White is a good corner, but he was hurt when the Bills made the playoffs. Pat Surtain with the Broncos, they didn't make the playoffs. So how important is having a good corner? I know that the takeaways are good when we get those, but especially with our scheme not being reliant on a shutdown corner, I think this is a position that the Rams are moving away from valuing. If we valued it, we wouldn't have traded Jalen Ramsey, in my opinion. He came out later on. I think it was this week or last week. He said that he didn't even ask for a new contract from the Rams. He was just told by two people in the building that they were going to go a different direction with their team building philosophy. He's only like 28, 29 in his late 20s, so he would have been able to bridge that gap to the next era if they valued him financially. So I don't think that the Rams value the cornerback position anymore financially. I think this is going the way of the running back really around the league because of the Fangio system, and you don't need that shutdown corner. I think once teams really realize that having that guy isn't necessary for team success, then we're going to start seeing it being more and more devalued. I think we're getting to the point now where what made the Eagles so good is that you couldn't throw because they had two good corners out there. Offenses, the rules are so skewed toward offense now, and offensive coordinators and play callers are so good now in the league. If you've got one good corner, they'll just scheme him out of the game. We're not going to throw to that side of the field, or we're going to get that receiver in motion. We've seen so many times, especially against the Packers, when Devontae Adams, before he was moved to the Raiders, would motion to the other side of the field. Jalen Ramsey would be throwing like a fit on the boundary over there because he couldn't go over there with him because of the play call. So it's so easy for offenses to just scheme around one good corner or one great corner that you're better off having two good corners than one great corner and one average corner because they'll just pick on the average guy all game long. So it's a lot better to have your talent more spread out across the secondary than having just that stud. So again, I think that the Rams are moving away from valuing the corner position financially. I think this is another spot where we're just going to kind of have a rolling tally of mid to late round draft picks coming in because the scheme is easy for the secondary, and I think that's how we're going to value it there. But financially, I believe we are going to begin to see the devaluation of the corner. So now we've seen the state of the roster. We've talked about what positions we value. Let's actually get into the draft now. We'll start with the picks that we have entering the draft. I'm going to simulate a couple trades, so this is where we're going to be. So let's take a look at the picks we have entering the draft. We have pick number 36 in the second round, pick 69 and pick 77 in the third round. The 77th pick there coming from Miami in the Ramsey trade. In the fifth round, we have 167, 171, 177, And in the 6th round, 182, 189, 191. And then we have 2 in the 7th round, 223 and 234. Now, this makes up for 11 total picks, but if you look at these, we have 11 total picks, and more than half of them come within 24 picks of each other. We have 25% of the picks around the whole league from pick 167 to pick 191. That is not a place that I think we're going to be just sitting and holding tight. I'm thinking we're going to have a lot of wheeling and dealing within that range, using some of those picks to move up or move back. And we're going to talk about some of that in the rest of the video. So at pick 36, we need a difference maker or more total players. Again, the goal of this draft is raising the floor of the roster so that we know the cracks in the foundation that we need to address in the offseason next year. So given that precedent, these are the guys that I'm looking for at pick 36. Number 1, Bijan Robinson. We're going to talk about all these individually and why I like that player only for this pick. We're not going to do it for every single player I name and every single pick, just for this one because it's such an important pick. But the number 1 player I'm trying to get at pick 36 is Bijan Robinson. Next would be Nolan Smith, the edge rusher from Georgia. After him would be Myles Murphy, edge rusher from Clemson. Safety Brian Branch out of Alabama. Wide receiver Quentin Johnson from TCU. Guard Osiris Torrance from Florida. And then the last person that I'm looking at pick 36 is Brian Brzee from Clemson, the defensive lineman. So like I said, we're going to go through all 7 of these, talk about why I would want them, and then what we would do if none of them are on the board. So looking at Bijan Robinson first, our best running game in the entire Sean McVay era was Todd Gurley's prime, back when McVay first joined the team. Since then, it's been just a collection of guys who are pretty good running backs, some injury-riddled, and just pretty unreliable overall. And the real key here is Cam Akers' inconsistencies. First is his ball security. Turnovers are something that we have to limit as much as possible. We live with some because of Stafford being the guy that he is, the quarterback that he is. We cannot afford inconsistency with ball security when it's turned around and handed off to the running back. Number 2 is his health. He had the Achilles injury. He's fully recovered from that. He had a great finish to the year, but he does just get, nicked and bruised a little bit more than other running backs here and there. And then third is his performance. He had a great December to end the season, but there's a key factor there. The last 4 weeks of the season, Thomas Brown was moved from tight ends coach to running backs coach, which was great then, but now he's been promoted to the offensive coordinator of the Carolina Panthers. So Akers couldn't do anything in the run game without Brown as his position coach. So what's our thought here? What's the reason that's going to change now that Thomas Brown's out of the building completely? I've never been in an NFL facility, but especially given that Brown was not just the tight ends coach, he was the assistant head coach when he was here. I would think that he and Akers should have still been talking even though he was the tight ends coach. I'm purely speculating here, but Akers, obviously his production shot up when Brown was his position coach, which he will no longer be. So I would be worried about his performance if he's the only back in the backfield. So Bijan Robinson would help to stabilize our running game for the future. All right, our offense has to better complement our defense with longer drives and more points. If you've watched our film breakdowns about the defense, you know that our defense is the quintessential bend but don't break defense. We're going to make the opponent drive the field at the expense of making plays in the backfield, maybe missing out on a couple turnovers, not having as tight of coverage, because we want to make sure that we do not give up explosive plays. That is the number one goal of our defense. So what you're going to have when you have those longer drives is, our defense is going to get tired. So if we, say the opponent starts on the 20-yard line like a touchback, we make them have a 15-play drive. We stop them on the goal line. They kick a field goal. That is an absolute win for our defense. The problem is we turn around and go 3 and out, and then the defense is expected to do that all over again. We have to be able to sustain drives on offense better so our defense can rest and do what they are programmed to do, which is slow the ball, not give up the big play, and keep the ball in front of them on defense. And the last point here with Robinson, again, these are not just all the things that I would do if I were in charge. These are things that I think are based in our historical precedent at the very least, the Les Snead era, but mostly with the Sean McVay and Les Snead era combo for the draft. We have a huge precedent for overlapping rookie running back contracts on day 2. This goes back to even when we had Todd Gurley. We had, I believe, it was the offseason that we extended Todd Gurley that we spent a third-round pick on Darrell Henderson. And then, we cut Gurley because he couldn't stay healthy, unfortunately. Man, one of the biggest what ifs, at least in Rams history, maybe NFL history, is what he could have been if he could have stayed healthy. But Henderson was picked in the 3rd round, while Gurley was supposed to be in his prime. We found out later he was leaving his prime, but we had all intentions of him coming back and having a monster 2019 season, and we spent a 3rd round pick on another running back. Then we let Gurley go. We thought it was going to be Henderson's time to shine. So then we turn around and pick a 2nd round running back in Cam Akers. Malcolm Brown's in here somewhere. He was undrafted, but we spent a 4th and a 6th round pick trading for Sony Michel too. But we do have a huge precedent for overlapping rookie running back contracts on day 2, and this would fit that mold with Akers having 2 years left on his contract, because he did have that the NFI list whenever he was coming out of college. So if you haven't seen that, we do have the ability to retain him as a restricted free agent at the end of this coming season. But I think a pick of Bijan Robinson, who could be potentially a top 5 running back in the league the second he enters it, would be a great way to not just stabilize our running back room, but our whole team, because we're going to have better ability to control the ball on offense and keep our defense off the field, so the defense can force longer drives and maybe hopefully turn some touchdowns into field goals and some maybe field goal drives into turnovers or punts. So next we're going to talk about Nolan Smith and Myles Murphy. I've got them on the same slide here because they play that edge rusher position together. The reason that I would take these is they are athletic freaks at a highly valued position. They are, in that 2nd tier of edge rusher, really kind of towards the bottom of that tier for most people. But they are athletic freaks, and it is a highly valued position, which makes it a very good pick in the 2nd round. They would pair well with a 2024 superstar acquisition, which is something that I think we are looking at. Just this afternoon, we found out that the Commanders were not going to pick up Chase Young's option. He is one of 4 or 5 players that I think could be in horns at the start of the 2024 season, which we'll talk about later. But I think they would pair well with a 2024, a big-name edge rusher free agent, better than some guys that we'll mention later on. I would pick Smith over Murphy just because, we require our outside linebackers to play some coverage. They've got to drop into a hook zone every now and then or play some curl flat. They don't just get to pin their ears back and rush like some of them would like to. But I do think that Murphy would probably be the preferred target for our front office, because whereas Nolan Smith is 6'3" and 240-ish, Murphy's like 6'5", 270. So a lot closer to that Leonard Floyd style of body than Nolan Smith is. Next on my list is Brian Branch. We have a ton of roster uncertainty in the secondary, and Branch is easily the best safety in the class. I think he's a top 15 player. The problem with him is that safety is, again, a devalued position league wide because of the rise of the Fangio system. But because of how much uncertainty we have in the back end with Scott and Rapp and Troy Hill and Jalen Ramsey leaving, I think taking a player who's a top 15 player in the class and can play from the roof as a safety, come down and play that nickel spot where we really like to have a run defender. That's why they put Ramsey there, is because he's not afraid to stick his nose in the run fit and make a tackle. I think that Branch would be a good fit for our secondary. So again, another way of saying that is he gives us flexibility to put our 5 best DBs as our secondary players. If our third best corner is better than our second safety, then Branch can play safety and our third best corner plays nickel. Vice versa, if our second safety is better than our third corner, then Branch comes down and plays the nickel, and we have 2 safeties and 2 corners outside of that. So he gives us a lot of versatility there, and he's a great player. I think he'd be a great pick if he's there at 36. Next, we're looking at Quentin Johnston. He is the only receiver that I like at this position because of his size. There are tons of small, fast receivers later in this draft that we can get. There are not many 6'2" players that can play that X receiver. The X receiver is the one that's normally the single receiver towards the backside. What you want in an X receiver is somebody who can take 2 defenders to cover, and I think that he's the closest to that kind of player in this draft. You can make an argument for a guy like Jalen Hyatt because of his speed, that you need to have somebody over the top. And as a Tennessee fan, I'd agree with you. I think he's being massively undervalued. But I think in terms of just a complete difference maker, Johnston has the edge here. And I don't know that Hyatt can be that much of a difference maker that we need to take him here at 36. Next is Osiris Torrance. I'm of the opinion that our offensive line is at least passable. I think there's so much unknown at our offensive line that they're really the quintessential group that needs to get found out for our 2024 season, so we can see which ones we need to replace in free agency next year. But we know that there aren't many Pro Bowl guys on our offensive line. Best case scenario is we have guys that are like above average to good, unless Havenstein or Alaric Jackson has a good season. They're the only 2 that I could see really being Pro Bowl kind of guys, which means we have room for a guy like Osiris Torrance, who I think is going to be probably a multi-year Pro Bowler throughout his career. And this is the difference of going from good to great. You've got to spend quite the premium to get from good to great. Jared Goff was a good quarterback. He still is a really good quarterback in Detroit, but he's not great. And it took trading 2 first-round picks to get a great quarterback. And that's kind of where we're at here. We're good on the offensive line in a best-case scenario, but we're not a great offensive line, and this would help us in that pursuit. So this is where I had some more notes about the Aaron Donald acquisition when he was drafted. We had 4 good defensive linemen. 2 of them were young studs with Quinn and Brockers, but it was far from the weakest unit on the team, and we spent a top half of the first-round pick on a defensive lineman for one of our better position groups on the team, maybe our best position group on the team, and I think that this would be a comparable use of resources. The last one that I'm looking at here at pick 36 is Brian Brzee. This is more of a personal idea than something I think that the team would actually do, but I do want to make mention of it. So he is really only dropping because he didn't play very well in 2023, and most of that was because he had quite a bit of tragedy in his family. He did play a little hurt, but most of it was the family stuff. I think he would fill that role across from Aaron Donald that Brockers and A-Rob played. super well. He is as strong as an ox, and he's huge, 6'5", 300 pounds, and he's a really good athlete for his size. I think that he would fit that role very, very well. And he's a lot more versatile than the other interior defensive linemen that we could get here. A fan favorite that I've seen is Devalued, but he's still, like 6'2", 280, and I don't think we're going to get another Aaron Donald that's that size. Same with Kalijah Cansey. I just can't see wanting to have two 6'1", 280-pound defensive linemen and hope that the other one's as good as Aaron Donald. Whereas maybe Brian Brzee is here and he's 6'5", 300 pounds and can bench press forever. I think that he's a lot more versatile than a guy like Mozzie Smith, who I think is more just kind of like a regular nose guard. Can't really play that 4-eye that we like to play, kind of just needs to stay over the center. But Brzee can play on all three spots of our defensive line, and I think that's what makes him the value here. So in that vein, he's bigger than a guy like Cansey or Devalued, and he's more versatile than a guy like Mozzie Smith. So this would be, I think, just a perfect addition to our defensive line. But again, I do think that given our current state of the position, we've already got our superstar defensive lineman, and our normal team build is we want like one stud at the position group, or especially on defense, one stud at each level of the defense, defensive line, linebacker, secondary, and then everybody else we just kind of need to be, average in baseball, what they would call like replacement level around them. And I think we've got enough replacement level guys that we don't quite need to spend the resources on Brzee. But again, my philosophy with pick 36 is like we need a difference maker, and that's what these guys have been. So we talked about those 7 players, and I think there's a better likelihood than not that none of them are there on pick 36 on Friday night, whether they make it out of the first round and somebody trades up, or maybe they just don't even make it out of the first round. But I think they're the only ones that have that difference maker potential and could fall for various reasons. The wide receiver class is very volatile as far as how media members view them. They are all over the map on who's wide receiver 1, who's wide receiver 10, and sometimes that's the same person just given 2 different people. Brian Branch being a safety, safety's being devalued. Same with Bijan Robinson. His position's devalued. Brzee kind of had a down year, but has a super high ceiling. Torrance kind of in that same mold as Robinson there. He's a guard. A lot of people just don't want to take a guard on day one. So there's a chance that some of those guys could fall to us, but I think in a more likely scenario, they probably don't. If none of them are there, then I think that we need to trade down. I don't think that there's anybody else that really has a real chance of being there. Like some of our favorites are Deonte Banks that we've seen. I don't think there's any way that he makes it. I'd be surprised if he makes it out of the top 20, to be honest. But I haven't seen any reason for him to be falling. We don't have any inclination that he won't be picked, in that, mid to late part of the first round. Where we don't have any inclination that he might make it out of the mid to late first round like we do some of these other players that we just talked about. So I tried to keep it that way. We could have made a whole list of players to go through, which other people have, especially at this network. But if they're not there, I think we need to trade down. So like I said, there's a likelihood that none of those players are available at 36, and I don't think there's any other true difference makers that can be, pillar players moving forward. So I think we trade down into that 50 to 60 range, maybe like 45 to 55. What we really want to do is pick up another top 100 pick right there at the back end of the third round with a trade. We're going to lose out on some fan favorites if we do that, especially if none of those 7 players we just talked about are available. The 3 fan favorites that I've seen that we're probably losing out on, number 1 is Will McDonald. So why don't I want Will McDonald at pick 36? I think he's good. He's a big projection. He played out of position at Iowa State, and trying to project him as an outside linebacker Again, we require our outside linebackers to play some coverage, and I'm not saying McDonald couldn't do it, but it's a huge projection to think that he's going to go from lining up head up on the tackle to head up on inside of the tackle in that 4-eye, and then, now playing in a 9 technique where he's got to cover the flat. So I think he could be good. He's a bit more of a projection, and I don't think he's going to be quite the difference maker that a Nolan Smith or a Miles Murphy could be. And what we don't want to do is don't want to spend a premium draft pick like number 36 on an edge rusher here and then bank on him, becoming a superstar and then not going for a superstar next offseason. So if that's my thought process, why do I say, Smith and Murphy are okay? Because I think Smith and Murphy are, super athletes. McDonald is a good athlete, and there's a difference there. If we could get Nolan Smith and Miles Murphy, even just by themselves, are probably okay. But I think them plus one of those guys that we'll talk about here later on would be we'd be cooking with gas on the edge. I think with McDonald at pick 36, then spending a bunch of money on another edge next offseason, I don't think we're going to get quite the return for McDonald where we're going to be like, this guy that we picked up in free agency is so good, we could have had somebody else at pick 36 that would fit better on the team than a guy like McDonald. Whereas Smith and Murphy are just supreme athletes that I think if they're the third priority from a defense, because we've got Aaron Donald, and then I'm assuming we get a free agent superstar edge rusher next offseason, that'll help Smith and Murphy a little more than it would help McDonald just because of their athleticism. The next one that we'd be losing out on most likely is Emmanuel Forbes, and I'm becoming of the notion here he might not even be available at pick 36. There's been a lot of buzz about him the last week or two. He's a good fit for our defense, but the value is just bad here. I talked about how I don't think we value the corner position anymore. I do think he'd be a great fit, especially for our off coverage. He's got super good instincts where he might be able to, get one of those pick sixes that he did in college, or at the very least just, some more turnovers on defense would help us out a ton. But I just don't think that we value the position that much anymore. We've got 3 guys already that have starting experience in the league with Durant and Kendrick and Rochelle. I don't see us spending a second-round pick whenever, we just had Jalen Ramsey and trade him away. I just don't. I think that's a bad value for how the Rams front office feels. Then the last one that we might be missing out on is JMS, John Michael Schmitz. So the reason I wouldn't want Schmitz is I don't think he has that same perennial Pro Bowl, All-Pro type of potential of an Osiris Torrance. I think he's going to be a really good player for a really long time, but I don't think he's just going to be like a great player. And that's what I'm looking for here at pick 36 is we need somebody who's going to be a great player, which is really hard at pick 36 because if you just know somebody's going to be a great player, then they ain't waiting around till number 36 to get picked. But that's why we're looking for those traits in those players like a Nolan Smith, a Miles Murphy, a Quentin Johnston. Whereas the guys on this list, aren't quite that level of athlete, in my opinion. So almost any other year, I would be thrilled to take John Michael Schmitz at 36. But we just have so many linemen that are, have that same potential I think that Schmitz does. We just have to find it out. And if we pick Schmitz, then, he's just kind of another guy in that group. Whereas Torrance, okay, he's going to be a pretty good guard for a really long time. And we just need to figure out the rest around him like we did when we got Aaron Donald. He's good. We're going to get good players, and we're going to figure out the rest later. That's what my philosophy here is at 36. So ultimately, with JMS, I just don't think the value's quite right here. There are plenty of other interior offensive line prospects later that can have a similar impact to JMS after the 2023 season. We don't, if we needed somebody to come start right away, he'd be great. But I think that they're more than happy with the five projected guys they have right now. And Osiris Torrance might make them reconsider that because of the level of player that he is, which I think is just one step above where JMS is at. So ultimately, I think it leads to us trading down in the mid to late second round. Number one on my board would be Zach Charbonnet, the running back out of UCLA. Again, I think we need to stabilize the running back position. We have that precedent of not just taking a running back on day two, but reaching for one. I don't remember Cam Akers being considered a top of the second round kind of pick like he was when we picked him. Definitely didn't hear Darrell Henderson in that conversation when we got him in the third round. So I think the 50 is maybe a little bit early for Charbonnet. I don't think he'll be there at pick 69 when we get there. So I think that's another reason to trade down there. I'm pretty confident he'd be there around 50, but getting closer to 70, 69 where we're at, that's where I wouldn't be as sure he's going to be there. And I think we need that power element that he brings. I would take him over Jahmyr Gibbs because of that. We've got a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs with Cam Akers. We need somebody who can get in between the tackles, grind out the tough yards, and keep that clock moving. So he could help stabilize the running back room, even if he's not the starter right away. This is our precedent. We're going to take a running back. We're going to give them a year or two to get their legs underneath them in the league, and then he would be the feature back when Akers leaves either next year or the next, depending on if they even tender him a restricted free agent offer, depending on how good whatever running back we bring in is. So after talking about JMS for that long, if he's still there at pick 50, let's just call it, I would be more than happy to take him because we're going to have that extra pick or two from trading back. Now, I wouldn't take him over Charbonnet again because I think of the impact long term. I think that by the time we would need somebody like John Michael Schmitz, we could get similar production from somebody later on in the draft. But he still could be available here. Definitely the most likely of McDonald, Forbes, and JMS to be here at in that mid to late second round area, and he'd be a good spot there. So another position here is wide receiver. This is not one that I would really like in the second round. I don't think that there's any wide receivers here that offer anything that we don't already have in-house. The one name that would be interesting is Jonathan Mingo, but he's kind of like Emmanuel Forbes just on the wide receiver side where he's becoming a very quick, very late high riser, whereas now I'm seeing that he might not even make it out of the first round, Jonathan Mingo either. Same with Forbes. But he would be just about the only one that I would be pretty excited about here in the mid to late second round. Like I said, I just don't think there's anything that the receivers outside of Mingo can really offer us. So Jalen Hyatt, Josh Downs, and Tank Dell, those are some of the ones that are consistently seen in that mid-late second round. And Hyatt, is a speedster to the nth degree. I think he's a lot better than he's given credit for by the media, but I don't think he gives us anything that like Tutu Atwell doesn't. I want to see more of Tutu Atwell. I thought he had a great season there. I thought he had a great finish to the season, and I want to see what he can do stretching the defense before trying to get somebody like a Jalen Hyatt. Josh Downs is pretty much just a slot receiver. Our slot is very well occupied by some guy named Cooper Kupp, and when Kupp is outside, then we've got like Ben Skoranek in the slot, who I think had a great season last year too, very underrated season. Then Tank Dell, whose comparison is Tutu Atwell. So why would we take Tutu Atwell 2.0 and still have Tutu Atwell on the roster? And, we still want to see more of Atwell. So I think there's just not a huge fit here. The only thing with Tank Dell is he can, return kicks and punts. He's got some experience there. But we can find that experience later on in the draft pretty easy. So I don't like the value here for the receivers. It's too early for those bigger-bodied guys. So that was the thing I liked about Quentin Johnston, right? That's why I'd have been okay taking him at 36 because I think that he's head and shoulders above these other 6'2 plus receivers. Cedric Tillman, A.T. Perry, Rashee Rice, Michael Wilson. They're the other bigger bodied guys, but this pick point here in the at 50 plus or minus 5 or 10 picks, I think it's a little too early for guys like them. Lastly, we've got tight end here. I think this is only worth it if we change to a 12 personnel focus. We're going to have Higbee back for his farewell season with the Rams, most likely. We just traded for Hunter Long in the Jalen Ramsey trade. I think that they're going to consider Hunter Long as like a bonus third-round pick. They said they really liked him when he came out of college. I was reading a lot of that whenever the trade went down. So I think that they think he's like a rookie here, especially given he's only got one career catch. But I think they're considering him like he's their tight end pick from this draft. And that's why I say it's only worth it if we change to a 12 personnel offense, because then we're going to have two tight ends on the field. So they would compete for that tight end 2 role this season. And then when Higbee's gone next season, they would be the first 2 guys up. But when we're only having one tight end on the field in our traditional 11 personnel offense, I don't want to take a tight end in the second round that has to compete with somebody who just came in to be the second tight end who's still not going to see the field. I think that if we're only going to have one tight end on the field, then we need to see what we have in Hunter Long before addressing that position in the next offseason if we need to, based on Long's performance this season. So some tight ends that we could consider here in the second round. If we're in the mid to late second round, Luke Musgrave and Darnell Washington are probably gone. Some guys that could be there if that's what the Rams look to draft. Sam Laporta, Tucker Kraft, they're kind of rising a little bit, especially Laporta. But Schoonmaker is one that I've seen more in that 3rd to 4th round range. So I'm pretty confident he'd be here at the very least as sort of a fallback option if they're just locked into taking a tight end here. But overall, I'm making this pick like a mock draft. Here with the 50th pick, plus or minus a couple picks, I'm taking Zach Charbonnet to stabilize our running room. So our next picks are towards the middle of the 3rd round. We've got 69 and 77. I think this is the sweet spot for a 2023 rotational player that can develop into a 2024 starter. And that description fits a couple different positions. First is the edge. So I'm sure pretty notoriously by now, I'm not a huge fan of taking just any edge rusher at 36, the best one on the board, unless it's a tier 2 edge rusher, a Nolan Smith or a Miles Murphy. I consider Will McDonald the top of tier 3, along with Anu Daikozama and some players like that. But on the edge for the 3rd round, we've got guys like Andre Carter, Isaiah Foskey, Isaiah McGuire. My 2 favorites around this area would be Byron Young and Derek Hall, but McGuire's growing on me a lot recently too. So I think there's plenty of options here where we can get very similar value from a guy like McDonald with some of these players for the 2023 season. Then in 2024, we can plan for them to develop as starters. But the difference is, say we take a Will McDonald in the 2nd round, and we've kind of talked about this already, but say we take Will McDonald at 36 if he's still there. What if Daniel Hardy has a better season than Will McDonald in 2023? And so if Hardy or, say Hoyt, I know that he's, going to be a free agent, but he's somebody that maybe could be re-signed if he has a good season, especially given his D-line depth. But let's say that whatever edge rusher we pick at 36 is not the best edge rusher on the team. I'm just locked in, and maybe it's wishful thinking. I'm just locked in that going into the 2024 season, we are going to have spent significant capital, whether it's free agent dollars whether it's draft capital, whether it's a mix of both, and we're going to have a top of the league edge rusher, and I've got some names we'll talk about later, but I'm convinced that we're going to have a top of the league edge rusher entering next season, the 2024 season. So if whatever edge rusher we pick at pick number 36 is not our next best edge rusher, that's going to feel like a really bad waste of resources next offseason whenever, we're starting a third year, seventh round pick over a second year, second round pick. And if there's one thing the Rams don't like to do, it's waste resources. You can talk about the dead cap and consider that a wasted resource, but whenever we're spending all that money next offseason, it ain't going to feel wasted. So the difference here with taking an edge rusher in the third round, especially the middle of the third round versus the top of the second round, that's a huge difference as far as how we view these players. Terrell Lewis wasn't even considered really a guy that should be starting until his third year in the league, and he was a mid to late third round pick. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. If these guys don't just take over the other side of the line from whatever superstar we get next offseason, then that doesn't just feel like a waste of resources to the same level that the 36th pick in the draft would have. I mean, 36th pick is almost a first round pick, and we know how the Rams value first round picks. So that would feel like just a huge waste of resources if we don't just get a stud like a Nolan Smith or Miles Murphy off the edge there compared to like a Will McDonald. But if we have Byron Young, who would be my pick here, if we have Byron Young and it's still better off, that he and Hardy or Keir Thomas, that they just have some sort of rotation opposite of, our 2024 acquisition there, then that doesn't feel like a waste of resources to me. Again, that same way that a 36th overall pick would have. So another position we could look at here would be our nickel safety position. These two kind of go together again. We kind of talked about it with Brian Branch, but we want to get the ability to get the 5 best defensive backs on the field. So some guys here that I like, Antonio Johnson, Jartavius Martin, and Jamie Robinson. Might be a little early for Robinson here, but I want to make sure that we can at least address the position, even if it's a little bit of a reach in the eyes of some. We could also look here for a corner that could convert to a safety position. Guys like Khalil Ringo and Cam Smith from South Carolina. There's, for different reasons, there's some rumors that they might need to convert to safety whenever they get to the league. And so this would, in a different way, it would offer us some depth with that nickel position too, because if, maybe they're not the second best safety on the team that needs to play next to Jordan Fuller next year, then they can play corner and bump, maybe Kobe Durant inside to the slot. So there's, again, some versatility there based on whatever is going to get the 5 best DBs on the field next season. So again, they double as corner potential there if they aren't the second best safety over the summer. Also look in the middle of the third round. This is where we could see some of those bigger-bodied wide receivers come into play. But the problem is we need a receiver that can return kicks. And I think that the perfect guy would be Marvin Mims. I think he's like 5'10", 5'11". He plays a bit bigger than he is. But the thing I like about him is not only does he return kicks, he's not a Tutu Atwell kind of player where he's a burner and he beats you with his speed. That's not all that Marvin Mims does. He's a good, well-rounded wide receiver as well. And I think he'd be a good pick here. But we'll talk a little bit about Mims in a second. So what I think we will do here in the middle of the third round, pick 69, this is where I'm taking my edge rusher, Byron Young. Maybe a little bit of a homer pick here as a Tennessee fan. Pretty raw, but he is a kind of in that Nolan Smith. He is a super athlete. He lit up the combine, and I would not be surprised to see him going in this range, and I hope it's us that takes him. Pick 77, I'm actually going to vote to trade back about 20 spots, get into that 90 to 100 range, and pick up an extra top 150 pick. So this would give us 2 picks in the top 75. This would give us 4 picks in the top 100, and this would give us 5 picks in the top 150. So if we're talking about raising the floor of our team by getting better depth, this is a great way to do it with 5 top 150 picks. So looking here at the late third round, now we suddenly have 2 picks. Remember, we got 1 from trading back from 36, then we got 1 from trading back from 77. This is where we would take our wide receiver / kick returner, and then that secondary player, that safety nickel kind of player. Ideally, this would still be able to be Marvin Mims. I'm not seeing him, in many people's top 120s, 150s. So I do think that he could be here in the third round, in the late third round. And then our safety nickel, we've still got that list of guys from the last slide or two. So we're at the end of day 2. It's the second round, the third round have passed. Here's what we're looking at. We made 2 trades. We traded pick 36, and because Les Snead likes to, give extra picks in trades, I'm going to say that we also gave away 182 for a late second and a late third. Then we traded picks number 77, and again, a 7th round pick here, 234 for a late 3 and a mid to late 4. So those are our trades. Players we came away with on Friday night. We got Zach Charbonnet and Byron Young. We've stabilized our running back room for the future. We have our project edge rusher here that is going to be at least a very good athlete on the edge. I think he's got a lot of Sam Ebicom to his game, and I think Ebicom is a good player, underrated, and I think that we would be able to use a guy like Young a lot differently now than we used Ebicom back then. We also got our wide receiver kick returner in Marvin Mims, and then at our nickel safety position, I'm going to hope that we got Antonio Johnson. He was mocked in the first round for some time, and then he ran like a 4.6 40 at the combine. So he's kind of fallen there, but we know that the Rams don't really care about 40 speed as long as you play fast on tape. Jamie Robinson would be our backup here, but I'm pretty confident we could probably still get Antonio Johnson there at the back end of the third round. So moving on to day 3, what we're looking at. Our overall picks, we have a mid to late 4th. We've got pick 167 and 171 in the 5th round, and 177 as well. In the 6th round, we've got 189 and 191. Then in the 7th round, we only have 1 pick now, pick 223. But looking at this list and comparing it to our pre-draft list, we have now really bridged the gap there between pick 77 and pick 167, and that's something they actually talked about in their press conference either this morning or yesterday morning, that there's a lot of people that, that's 90 picks in between pick 77 and pick 167, and there's a lot of good players that are going to come off the board in that time. So being able to bridge that gap between those two would be a very good thing for us to do, I believe. So looking in the mid to late 4th round, this is where I think the value for our interior offensive line acquisition is. I like Olusegun Oluwatimi, the center from Michigan. I think he's a high-level player who could play all 3 spots on the interior. I think he would give us good depth for this season, potentially take over next season. I don't think that's something that the Rams would be best served to do as far as getting another unproven starter and giving them starter reps next season. I don't want to go into the 2024 season with offensive line holes and question marks personally, but I think Oluwatimi he's a high IQ player, and I think that he would be a good spot for us at the very least for depth across the interior. Ricky Stromberg is another one. He can play all 3 spots on the interior. Pretty good athlete, and he would just kind of be the backup if Oluwatimi isn't there. Then lastly would be Andrew Voorhees, the lineman that tore his ACL at the combine from USC. He's pretty much only a guard, but as a guard, he was originally a day 2 prospect before that injury. So this is really more of a 2024 depth pick. and somebody who could eventually be a starter for us on the interior as he goes through his career. Another position that we could look at in the fourth round is corner. This is where the Rams really like to take their corners. Rochelle was a fourth round pick. Durant was a fourth round pick. And then I think we had another fourth round pick. It wasn't David Long, but sometime in between there, we got another fourth round pick in the corner. So recently, this is where the Rams like to take corners. In the last 2 years, we got Durant in the fourth round and Robert Rochelle in the fourth round. So we know that this is a place that they like to take corners, and that's kind of what I was focusing on with this whole exercise is what would I do based on what the Rams have done in the past. So at corner here in the fourth round could be Darius Rush, Clark Phillips, Jacorian Bennett, DJ Turner, Trey Hodges-Tomlinson, Eli Ricks. Some of these guys are more likely than others to be there, especially Eli Ricks and Hodges-Tomlinson. I think will be there in the fourth round. The other four, maybe not so much, but we can hope. But this is a place that I do think that they could address the corner position as well. So moving on to our 3 picks in the late fifth round. This is where we need to start thinking more toward roster depth versus players that could potentially start for us in the next 2 or 3 years. Again, where we're thinking really about building that floor of the roster and getting drafted depth instead of undrafted depth. At the fifth round, this is where I think we need to address our inside linebacker depth. The first one that I would be picking would be Noah Sewell. I don't think he will last till the late fifth round, at the very least just because of his athleticism. I think the fourth round is probably where he will go, but I think that's a little too early for us to consider picking a second string inside linebacker, especially since we just we got rid of Bobby Wagner. This is a position that we devalue so much. I didn't even think we need to put it on the devaluation spot because it's very known how much we do not value the inside linebacker position. So if Sewell is still there in the fifth round, I would be running the card to the podium. I don't think he'll be there. Another one I like is Owen Papo. I also don't think he'll be there. I think there's a better chance that he's there than Sewell, but I think he's still a good enough athlete that somebody will just take a chance on that athleticism before then. The one that's interesting here to me is Henry To'oTo'o because, a year ago he was projected to be like a day 2 pick, and then he just started lowering and lowering and lowering over the year. I think he's a player with really good instincts. He's a really good athlete too, not quite to the level of Sewell or Papo, but definitely a good enough athlete to be a ILB number 2 and somebody who could develop into maybe being number 1 if assuming we don't keep Ernest Jones after his rookie contract, just because that would require paying more than $1 million to an inside linebacker. But I think To'oTo'o is a really good player. Again, I'm a Tennessee fan. He went to Tennessee for a while, and I loved watching him play there. But I think this would be about the place that he's going to go in the draft. And I think we're a team that could use another inside linebacker. We've only got, as far as I know, we only have Jake Hummel and Christian Roseboom as backups to Ernest Jones, and we like to have 4 on the roster, I believe. So I think he would have some more upside than those two potentially long term. The defensive line would be a good place to address here in the late fifth round. This is assuming that we don't take a Brian Brzee earlier in the draft, that just one really good one falls to us, which I don't really anticipate. But I do think we need some more overall depth and, just to add another body to that room that could play in the future. 2 that I like are DJ Dale and Byron Young. This is not the Byron Young edge rusher from Tennessee. This is the defensive lineman from Alabama. Both of these guys are from Alabama. Probably the position, the prospects I know the least about in this draft is the defensive line, the interior line. But these are 2 that I like and I think that are in that late 5th, early 6th, that mid to late day 3 kind of range. And I think this is where we kind of need to start thinking about addressing our D-line depth. Also in the late 5th round, we could take a running back. If we have addressed the D-line by this point, then we probably haven't addressed the running back position yet. I know there's quite a few people that hope we wait until this late in the draft to address a running back, but this would not really stabilize the room to me where a second-round pick would. But some guys that might be here, we got Dwayne McBride, Zach Evans, Tyjae Spears, Kendre Miller, Eric Gray, and Israel Abanikanda. Gray and Abanikanda being my two favorites at this juncture. Uh, Running back, especially, is a highly volatile position based on different team needs, different styles of running back that you need. I think Gray and Abanikanda would be two very good fits for our offense. They're those zone kind of backs. So they'll cut up inside between the tackles and get what they can get there with the athleticism to also squirt out of a couple tackles and break some explosive runs. So I think they have the potential, but I don't think that they have quite the floor of a guy like Charbonnet, who will, at the very least, we know he can get 4 yards if we need him. Then the last thing that we would be probably looking to address here would be whichever interior offensive line or corner that doesn't get addressed in the 4th round. So some corners that we might see at this juncture would be Mekhi Blackman, Regjon Wright, Jalen Jones, and Darrell Luter Jr. Luter Jr. would be interesting because he's a small college kind of guy, just like Durant was. So I think he'd be an interesting pick there for us. On the interior of the offensive line, there's Nick Broker, Jarrett Patterson, and Juice Scruggs. That could all be considered here in the late 5th round. So we're halfway through day 3. Let's hit the home stretch. Recap real quick. We have addressed throughout the entire draft. We've addressed our running backs, wide receivers, interior offensive line, inside linebackers, defensive line, and our defensive backs. What we still need is a backup quarterback. We still need some specialists. And I would like to see us get one more tight end / fullback body now that we are later in the draft. Bryson Hopkins also only has 1 year left on his deal. I thought he had a pretty good finish to last season, but I don't know if it was an anomaly or if that was, what we're going to get from him. So at least if we take a tight end or fullback in the 6th or 7th round, and if he's not as good as Bryson Hopkins, then he's a lot easier to let go than, if we take somebody in the 2nd or 3rd round and then, maybe they battle it out and, then it's pretty much just Hopkins is off the team because they're not going to cut Long that we just got in the Ramsey trade either. So I think this is a good place to get one where maybe we get, if Hopkins is better, then we can probably squeeze somebody through the practice squad until, next year whenever that roster spot opens up when Hopkins leaves. So in the 6th round, we have 2 picks. At quarterback, we could have Aiden O'Connell, Jake Hayner, Tanner McKee, Stetson Bennett, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, DTR. There's a couple of these guys that probably go in the 4th and 5th round, but with these quarterbacks, that when you're not getting a top-tier quarterback, you never know where these guys are going to go, and it seems like they just fall every year. My favorite of this group is DTR. I think he's got the highest ceiling because of his athleticism, and he would have time to develop. We're not going to ask him to come and be a starter next year. I think we have Stafford for at least 2 more years before he retires. I don't know if he makes it all the way through 2026 when I think his contract is up, 26 or 27. But I think we have him for at least 2 more years. He's definitely not going to retire, after the 2023 season and endure the bumps that are going to come this season inevitably just to retire. So I think we have at least 2 years where we could develop a guy like DTR. We know that McVay has some mobile quarterback stuff in the package because of having Bryce Perkins. And I think DTR ultimately is kind of like Jalen Hurts Jr. a little bit in that, he's that 6'2", he's tough, he's strong, and we'd give him that time to develop, hopefully into that kind of player whenever Matt Stafford's ready to call it a career. So I think ultimately he has the best traits of any of these quarterbacks athletically, and we could hopefully teach him the rest before it's truly needed for us. We're also looking probably at a punter in this range. Bryce Baringer, Adam Corsack, and Michael Turk are kind of the consensus top 3 punters this year, with Baringer being the best of the bunch. I think that'd be a good pick here in the 6th round at the very least, just so we get that extra year of control. I don't know that we'll ever pay a specialist again, at least under Sean McVay and Les Snead, the way we did Johnny Hecker. So we can get the best one of the bunch, hopefully, here in the 6th round. And the difference there, again, being if he's a UDFA, then we have to worry about a tender in going into year 4, whereas if we draft him, then we get that 4th year in the rookie contract. Some kickers, Jake Moody from Michigan. There's Jack Podlesny from Georgia. And then BT Potter from Clemson. The only reason I've even got Potter on this list is because the Rams have met with him. I think he's, 3 of 3 here on this list behind Moody and Podlesny. But I did include him because the Rams met with him. Moody would be my preference. But, you can never, Sean McVay and kickers. But really, especially at kicker, what this is going to be is this is just going to be the preferred guy trying out. I think we're going to have kicker tryouts, not just in the offseason, but throughout the regular season. It's going to be very 2020 in that sense where we don't know who our kicker is going to be long term. We've got the whole year to figure it out. And hopefully by the time we go into 2024, we have found, who our next long-term kicker is going to be. But this pick right here, if it's a kicker, would just solidify, okay, you've got the first shot. But if you mess it up, then you're just as gone as like you would be if you were a UDFA. But those are the 3 that I would see being picked here. So here in the 7th round, our last pick, we could be taking the specialist that we didn't take the pick before in the 6th round, or this would be a place where we could look at a tight end that I mentioned earlier. Payne Durham could be here, Brenton Strange, and Davis Allen and Will Mallory. All these are guys that could potentially be there. Maybe they get drafted a little earlier. Payne Durham had a good Senior Bowl week. Davis Allen's getting some notoriety now as a pretty good blocker with some good hand skills. Will Mallory can move a little bit. But if they're still here, it'd be worth a flyer on somebody that could push Bryson Hopkins for that tight end 3 spot on the roster. So let's look at the impact of our draft on our 2023 roster. We're going to go position by position. At quarterback, we would have Stafford and DTR. I think this would be a place we would get a veteran quarterback and bring them in post-draft as well. You're a heartbeat away from being QB1, and I don't think you want to go out there in week 2 and Stafford, get hurt in some capacity. Hopefully nothing bad, but if he gets hurt in any capacity, you don't want DTR going out there that quick. So I think this would be a place for a veteran quarterback addition post-draft. Running back, we'd have Cam Akers as our RB1. Then if he needs a break and we need something between the tackles, then we've got Charbonnet. If it's 3rd down and Akers still needs a break, we've got Kyron Williams. Then you've got Ronnie Rivers holding down the RB4 spot back there. At wide receiver, we would have Cooper Kupp, Van Jefferson, Ben Skoranek, Tutu Atwell, Marvin Mims, and Lance McCutcheon. I think that is a very encouraging wide receiver room there going into the year. We know that 90% of the time at the lowest, pretty much we can expect to have 3 receivers on the field. So we can count on having Kupp and Jefferson on the field, and then Skoranek and Atwell rotate between that wide receiver 3 role based on what the Rams are trying to get accomplished on that down. Then we've got Mims and McCutcheon developing still. I think that this is a very good way to enter the season. Then maybe throughout the season, if we see some good things from Skoranek and Atwell and the playoffs aren't quite looking good, then Van Jefferson becomes a trade piece at the deadline. Maybe we get a extra mid-round pick next season for it. Or, maybe Van Jefferson develops into the wide receiver 2 that we need. And in his contract year, he earns himself another contract. So I think that the Allen Robinson trade really opened up space to see what we have in the receivers we have here in the 2023 season. I'm excited to see what we have from this group. At tight end, we'd have Tyler Higbee, Hunter Long, Bryson Hopkins, and then with our last pick, I took Brenton Strange. I chose Strange just because I think he's got a little bit more of blocker capability where he can sort of play not just tight end, but I think he could also play some fullback too. Whereas a guy like Davis Allen is big enough, we probably don't want to put him in a fullback role. He's like 6'6", kind of like Higbee, a a little too big to be back there in the backfield. So I went with Strange there. He'd be pushing Hopkins for that tight end 3 spot behind Higbee and Long. On the offensive line, we've got Joe Noteboom. We've got Alaric Jackson, Brian Allen, Cole Shelton, and Rob Havenstein. Those are going to be our starting 5. It seems like Jackson might end up being the left tackle and Noteboom the left guard. I think that maybe could get switched in training camp. I think Noteboom was better at tackle than guard, and Jackson I think is going to be good anywhere he plays. Our backups, we'd have AJ Arcuri, Logan Bruss, Tremaine Ankrum, Zach Thomas, and then in the 4th round we took Olu Oluwatimi from Michigan, the center out of Michigan, instead of a corner. We went with Oluwatimi there. So talking about this offensive line room, I think that this is a very average to above average, maybe good offensive line if everybody just has a great season. But this is more of this is really a place where we've got to see who can hang and who needs to be replaced in 2024. So with this offensive line room, we've got a pretty limited ceiling, I think, but we do have depth, and we had better depth than we got really recognized for last year because all the depth got hurt too. I don't see that happening 2 years in a row. One of the things that I like about this offensive line room is that we will always be able to have our 5 best offensive linemen on the field. Let's say that Noteboom's playing left tackle and he gets hurt. Then you just move Jackson over to left tackle and insert your next best guard, Bruss or Ankrum, there at left guard, or Oluwatimi potentially. Let's say Brian Allen gets hurt. You move Coleman Shelton over to center, and then you still insert your next best guard at right guard, or Oluwatimi plays center. Whoever the best 5 offensive linemen are, we will be able to shift the line around enough to where we can insert them in. All right, next we'll talk about the defense. We've got on our defensive line Aaron Donald, Bobby Brown, Marquise Copeland, Jonah Williams, Laurel Murchison, and in the 5th round we took DJ Dale, the defensive lineman out of Alabama. I think we've got a lot of different skill sets here on the defensive line that we can use, especially with Aaron Donald there, and then we've got a bunch of guys around him that we need to see what we have in them this season. On the edge, we would have Michael Hoyt, Daniel Hardy, Keir Thomas, then we took Byron Young in the 3rd round. This is a pretty good group of guys that just need snaps. We got to see what we got in these 4 guys to see who can rise up and be that starter next to whoever we get to pair with them on the edge next offseason. On the interior of the linebacking group, we've got Ernest Jones, Christian Roseboom, Jake Hummel, and we took Henry To'o with one of our 5th round picks, again assuming that Noah Sewell and Owen Papo are gone. Jones is our starter. He's our man, probably wearing the green dot, either him or Jordan Fuller. And then whenever we have 2 linebacker sets, it'll be a battle between Roseboom and Hummel probably. Maybe To'o can insert himself into that mix this year. We'll see. On the corner, we've got Kobe Durant, Darian Kendrick, Robert Rochelle. Then we took in the 4th round small school linebacker Darrell Luter Jr. So we are 4 deep at the corner spot. Then at safety, we've got Jordan Fuller, Quentin Lake, Russ Yeast, and Antonio Johnson. Remember, Jamie Robinson was our backup there. This is one of the bigger stretches in the draft that I had, having him fall there to the bottom of the 3rd round. But here we've got the ability to play our 5 best DBs. We could have Kobe Durant and Darian Kendrick on the corner with Johnson in the slot and Fuller and Lake or Yeast as our 2 safeties. Maybe Robert Rochelle is better than Quentin Lake. And we have the Durant, Kendrick, and Rochelle as our 3 corners, one of them playing nickel, and then Fuller and Johnson playing safety. There's plenty of different ways this could shake out, and we'd be able to get our 5 best DBs on the field. So lastly, let's talk about our 2024 outlook, some things we would need to do to be ready for that 2024 season. Again, I think it's hard to think about this offseason in a vacuum, this draft in a vacuum, without having that lens of 2024. So a quick reminder of what we have in 2024. we will have $75 million available in cap space to spend. And we know that Les Snead can work some magic with the cap. So having $75 million for him is an incredible amount of money to be able to make upgrades to this team. We have all of our picks in the entire draft except our 7th-round pick. We have an extra 6th-round pick from Denver. And then right now we are projected to get 2 6th-round and 2 7th-round compensatory picks. So things we need to be looking to do in 2024. We need to get one of the best edge rushers on the market in free agency. There's 4 guys that I'm really looking at that I would like to see one of them in horns. In no particular order, but one I alluded to earlier was Chase Young. Got his 5th-year option declined today by the Commanders. So he is a free agent unless he's franchise tagged. Montez Sweat is playing out his 5th-year option this year, also on the Commanders. And those two are interesting because they've already paid defensive lineman Jonathan Allen. They paid Deron Payne this offseason. I cannot imagine them being able to pay 2 edge rushers, maybe not top of the market money, but like 2nd-tier edge rusher money. They cannot possibly afford to pay 4 defensive linemen that kind of money. So I think at least one of them hits the market. Maybe both of them hit the market unless somebody makes a trade for them and extends them before they hit the market, for a different team. But I think we will see at least one of them on the open market next offseason. There's also Josh Allen, the edge rusher in Jacksonville. He is a really, really good edge rusher. The only reason that Jacksonville might let him go is because they did take Trayvon Walker number 1 overall last year. And if you extend a guy like Josh Allen, then kind of in that same situation as the Commanders, what are you going to do in, 1 year at that point next off season whenever Trayvon Walker's up for extension and you took him number 1 overall. So then you kind of have a who we going to pay situation there too. Then the 4th one that I think could potentially be available is Brian Burns. We've already tried trading for him once, so we know that he is a favorite of the front office staff. I think that's another potential option, if we are, in the playoff hunt, which I think we should be with the roster we just talked about. I think that is a maybe not a division winning team based on San Francisco, maybe their quarterback situation. The Seahawks, I don't think Geno Smith is going to do quite as well as he did last year, but I think overall they're going to have a really good team, especially with having 2 picks in the top 20. But I think that we're at least going to be competing for a wild card spot, and I don't know about the same in Carolina. I think if they realize they aren't going to extend Burns, then maybe he becomes a potential trade option there in the middle of the season, especially if, we're in the hunt. I think he's somebody that we might unload that 1st-round pick for if we like him enough and we're in the hunt. If we are not in the playoff hunt, I think we are going to be keeping our 1st-round pick. And 8 years in, we'll finally be making the first-round pick of the Sean McVay era. Number 2, we have to replace any holes on the offensive line. And this is why Osiris Torrance is the only interior offensive lineman I would take in this draft, because I don't think that any other offensive lineman we take could start on the interior. I think Schmitz maybe could start, but I wouldn't want to take that gamble that he doesn't become a starter, and then we get into 2024 and we're like, well, we don't know what we have in him, so we need to find that out. We can't need to find anything out about any offensive lineman going into the 2024 season. With it potentially being Aaron Donald's last season, we cannot have any questions about the roster. We need to go in ready to make a run for the Super Bowl. And that's not going to happen if we aren't sure what we have in our offensive linemen. Brian Allen's contract is up. Coleman Shelton's contract is up. Noteboom could be cut and save about $5 million if I read the cap right. So we need to be figuring out who needs to stay and who needs to go this season. Third, we need to find our long-term tight end one, and that's where we need to see if it could be Hunter Long. If it's not Hunter Long, then we need to see who it's going to be. That's why I don't think that this is the year to take a tight end high. There are a couple tight ends that could be available next offseason that are good. If Atlanta starts getting a little squammy, if Kyle Pitts has another kind of up and down season, he could be there. Evan Ingram's playing on the franchise tag. Then in the draft, you've got Brock Bowers, who, even though this could be a legendarily great tight end class, I still think Brock Bowers would be the number one tight end this year if he could come out. So the best tight end that's not in the NFL in the world is still not going to be in the NFL next year. If we have a bad season and we're picking in the top 10, I think that we go all in on Brock Bowers, not on Marvin Harrison Jr., who I also think will be great, but I think that Brock Bowers would be a better fit for us long term with needing a tight end, and we like and how Sean McVay likes to use his tight ends. And then the last thing we need to do next offseason is make sure that we have wide receiver 2 and CB2. We're assuming that that Kobe Durant is CB1. I don't know that he will be, a top 10 corner in the league ever. But remember, we talked about in the beginning, we don't need a top 10 corner. We need 2 top 30 corners, 2 top 40 corners, 2 guys that make it difficult to throw to their side of the field on both sides. We need to make sure that we have 2 guys that make it hard for the quarterback to throw their way. And then we need to make sure that Cooper Kupp is not the only receiver. It could be Van Jefferson. He's going to be that wide receiver 2 this year. He was put into that role when we traded Allen Robinson. So we will find out this year whether it could be Jefferson. If it's not, then the free agent market next year is vastly different than this year. As of right now, we still have names like T. Higgins, Jerry Jeudy that are going to be on the open market, guys that have some big potential there too. And maybe we see some stepping up from Skoranek or Tutu Atwell. That's why I said we just need to make sure these guys are in the building going into the 2024 season. Maybe they're there right now, and they're just developing, and we're going to find that out this year. But that's the whole point of our 2023 season, being a figuring out what we have so that whatever we don't have, we can go get next offseason. So we talked about our history as a franchise the last 10 or so years in the draft. Talked about how I would do the draft, what I would want to see in my team based on our history, and then how that should set us up for a successful run into our next era, the last couple years of AD, and the last years of this group of pillars, and trying to find our next group of pillars next offseason. I can't wait for the draft tomorrow night. I'm sure if you've stuck around this long, neither can you. Let me know how crazy I am about some of my picks in the comments down below. And be on the look for more film breakdowns post-draft. We'll start looking at some players that, however it looks in the draft, are going to be taking on some bigger roles and seeing what they're going to be doing on our team next season.